Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. Liren against Magnus Carlsen, world number 3 against world number 1. This was played last night on the first day of the Charity Cup. That's the latest online rapid play tournament in the Champions Chess Tour, organised by the Play Magnus Group. And this Charity Cup is a really special event because the Play Magnus Group have partnered with UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, to raise funds for children in Ukraine. So I'm personally really delighted to be part of the event. I'm commentating with Peter Lecco. Always a pleasure to do that. Such a nice guy and so knowledgeable. So do join us. Chess24.com. It's absolutely fascinating event. Really such an interesting field of players. Anyway, this is played on the first day. And this features a really extraordinary opening novelty, actually. So Ding with white, and he plays his customary d4. And Carlsen plays g6. Now that shows he's ready for a really full-blooded fight, basically. Would he play the Grunfeld? Who knows? But Ding played his customary anti-Grunfeld system f3. So he has a vast amount of experience with this line. d5 takes, now e4. Notice the knight cannot exchange here, so the knight goes back, and knight c3, so that keeps more pieces on the board. And Ding has excellent results with this line. But that's not to Magnus's taste. He played instead e6. It looks very strange with these two pawns here. But of course the idea is to play d5 and the pawn is supported by the pawn on e6. But e4, so it looks completely daft. But now c5. So actually this heads back into a standard Benoni position, where white has played the line with pawn to f3. It's very well known. So bishop g5 provokes h6. Bishop drops back. a6, black wants to play b5. White stops that. And queen d2. And rook e8. This is a well-known position. Hundreds of games have been played starting from this point. First of all, we should deal with this move. Is it possible to play bishop h6? Well, yes, but it's not very good because of knight takes pawn. Now that has to be taken. And queen h4 check. Checks the king, attacks the bishop. And after this exchange, notice that knight cannot check because it's pinned. And because black has this fantastic dark square bishop, then black is absolutely fine in this position. So generally here, white has to decide how should he bring these pieces into the game. Well, bishop e2 has been played, and then a little shuffle to bring the knight out. That's playable. Another way to play the position is simply to play knight e2, and then knight g3, and then bishop e2, etc. But here, Ding played an extraordinary novelty. He played bishop c4. Never been played before, at least according to my database. It's certainly not the top line of computers either, but it's bubbling in there. So it's kind of a computer suggestion, but not the top line. So what's the big idea? Well, Carlsen played knight d7, which looks absolutely normal, to just hit the bishop. And Ding followed with bishop e2. Now that's an extraordinary idea. So why on earth has he lost a tempo in this way? Well, the point is this, that white wants to play knight h3 to f2. So for example, if this pawn is moved, then knight h3, and the knight comes back to f2, and this pawn structure is secure, and white's minor pieces actually are very harmoniously placed. So even though white has lost the tempo with the bishop, it's worth doing that. And this is well known to be a very good setup for white. So that's the big idea. So Carlsen played knight e5. So that means if knight h3, then that can be exchanged off, just breaking white's kingside pawns. No good. But now, because the e file is blocked with the bishop on e2, it is possible to take on h6. So is this a pawn for free? Well, not quite, because knight takes pawn is still possible. This is the game continuation. Knight takes. Queen h4 check. As before, hits king and bishop. Queen exchange. But here is the point. With the e-file blocked, it's actually possible to win the exchange. And after 19 moves, this was the first moment in the game where Ding actually reflected for any length of time. Why did Carlsen go in for this? He's the exchange down. Well, he does have two bishops. This knight is actively placed. This bishop is the really strong piece. It has no opponent. And white has a little bit of trouble actually developing the kingside pieces. So there is some compensation. But I suspect, I mean, as I said, Ding was playing very quickly. He must have reached this position on his computer and it probably just said better for white. But then he had to work out at the board, why is this better for white? How should he play? So he played h4, and that will allow this knight into the game. h5. Now obviously if that's exchanged off, then the rook comes into play. So Carlsen keeps it closed. That means there's a nice passed h pawn. At the moment it's not going anywhere, but it means that that bishop is a little bit restricted. Knight h3, the knight finally comes into play. And now if this knight can bounce back, then white is sort of close to consolidating basically, or a step forward anyway. So Carlsen opened up the position for his minor pieces, and that's dangerous. So that helps the bishop on d7 get into the game. Likewise the bishop on h6, and this knight too. And Ding played a very practical move here. He simply exchanged off the knight and then put his knight on f4, which sort of blocks out the bishop on h6. Now the knight isn't really going anywhere, but at least it's secure. He doesn't have to worry about it. And now the task is to try and get his rooks into the game, or at least get his kingside pawns rolling. But black does have those two bishops. King f2, bishop g7. So this bishop steps into the game. Might check on d4, might just take the pawn here. King g2 steps out of the check, and now h6 might become more of a threat. Now if bishop takes b2, then the rook will crash into the position. So Carlsen played bishop f5, threatening a check, but also covering b1. And Ding had a little bit of a think here, thought for almost 2 minutes. Remember, the time control is 15 minutes plus 10 seconds each time you make a move. So it's rapid play. King f3 with the idea g4. Ding allows that pawn to be taken. Now the b1 square is covered, but Ding plays rook b1 anyway. So Carlsen takes back the exchange. The bishop is hit, has to go back, and this is Ding's idea. Basically, he's broken through into black's position. Now, pawns are still level, but the king has to drop back to cover the pawn on f7, and that rook is such a powerful piece. And now it's time for Ding to advance with g4. So if black does nothing, these pawns are just going to roll down the board, and that's winning for white. So Carlsen desperately needs counterplay. The rook isn't going anywhere. This is black's only chance. Can this pawn advance? Well, if c4, the rook just goes behind. And then h6, g5, white must be winning that position. So first of all, Carlsen played rook c8. Now with the rook behind it, that pawn will be turbocharged. But Ding just carried on the king side. So in this phase of the game, you need to calculate. Because if you get it wrong, then one of those pawns could just roll home. So that needs to be taken. Pawn takes. Now if c3, then the pawn advances, and if that's taken, well, this is winning for white. This is an easy bit of calculation. Pawn exchanges, and knight d3, the king comes over to collect the pawn. So the king has to step across to stop the g-pawn. But finally, that knight has found a beautiful square on e6. Now this is a crunch moment. Again, Ding invested a little bit of time here. There's kind of a safe option, which does give white some chances, and that's rook c7. The problem is that how exactly does white make progress here? The king comes across to just manage the pawn, but actually it's really hard to make progress here. The king can't step up. I mean, at some moment this knight is going to have to flip around to take this pawn, but black is going to get sufficient counterplay. So Ding decided on this move. Now, this is very brave and absolutely the best move. But it takes guts to play like this. Now here Carlsen played a5. c2 is obviously critical. The point is this, that this bishop is dominated by the knight. Obviously can't check here. This can be taken. Can't check from g5. Can't come around to h6 because that square is controlled. And can't check on b2 because of the rook. But it's pretty scary. And then the rook is going to come around here. Well, white has pretty serious winning chances. Carlsen played a5 and king c2. And now white threatens to just take that pawn. Carlsen's problem is that rook cannot leave the 8th rank because it'll just be checkmate. So he's passive. Now, Ding did some shuffling. He, didn't have so much time, but every time he makes a move, then he gets 10 seconds added. So he was gaining a little bit of time, but also just, working out what to do. So he's put his rook behind the c-pawn. And now he advanced the king over to the king side. Carlsen can do nothing here. He can only wait. And the king came across. Beautiful maneuver. And notice how, again, that knight dominates the bishop, so the king can't be dislodged from there. There's nothing that black can do. g7, and that was the final move of the game. So why did Carlsen resign? Well, if rook a8, then king g6. And then the threat is rook here and rook f8. So for example here, only thing for black to do is give up the bishop. And knight g5 threatens mate. Well, okay, black can give up the rook, but obviously that's going to be mate in a few moves. Wow, what brilliant technique from Ding Liren. And what an interesting novelty. Bishop c4, I'm sure we're going to see more of that move. Although it's not completely clear. As I said, h5 is maybe the way to go, but we shall see. But yeah, fantastic technique from Ding Liren. This is a great tournament. Do join me online on chess24.com. As I said, I'm broadcasting, I'm commentating live with Peter Lecco. There are other commentary teams as well if you prefer them. It's a great event and for a really good cause. Play Magnus Group partnering with UNICEF. Hopefully I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.